welcome to the penultimate edition of our summer lecture series, Throwback Thursdays. This is number 6. I'm your host, Rob Schwenker, and we are delighted to have you with us tonight. Obviously, we are bringing this program to you, your living room, or kitchen, or bedroom, or outside, or wherever you happen to be in the comfort of your home, as opposed to having you as an honored guest in the lobby of our museum, which is what we love to do. And obviously we can't welcome guests at this point, and so we are bringing the museum to you. We hope that you might consider a donation of any amount to us at the Santa Monica History Museum to help keep programs like this going. We are 100% supported by your generosity. So we appreciate it and we thank you. And we hope you'll consider a donation of any amount tonight. We have someone that we are proud to call a colleague. He is Larry Balmagia. Larry right there. Larry Balmagia is an Emmy-winning and Golden Globe-winning writer and producer. He's worked on many of television's most iconic shows, including MASH, Cheers, Wings, and the one that I remember him from, Saved by the Bell. And his is the first name that comes up in the credits. So thanks for that. Larry made his first script sale as an undergrad in college, full disclosure, UCLA. But even before that, growing up in Hollywood in the shadow of Paramount Studios, Larry would sneak onto the lot as a kid to play on the Old West set they used for the TV drama Bonanza. And he would dig into refuse bins for old Dick Van Dyke Show scripts. Years later, Larry would be able to proudly drive through the gates of Paramount as a working writer and provide the refuse bins with scripts of his own. Without further ado, Larry Balmagia.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thanks for the great introduction. All right, well, I just a little bit about what's behind me. This is the old Herald-Examiner building downtown. It's still there. I think it's actually been declared a landmark. And my talk is going to be about newspapers in LA in the early part of the 20th century, specifically 2 women reporters that really became stars in their own right. So let's begin. Before there was Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and 24-hour news available at thumb tips, there were newspapers. In Los Angeles, you might grab a fresh edition of the Times, or the Los Angeles Record, the Citizen News, or the Post, or perhaps one of the Hearst-owned papers, the Examiner, the Herald Express, or the Herald or the Express rather. And there were papers that fought for causes like the crusading Manchester Bodie's Daily News, or served minority communities like the Sentinel and the California Eagle. We had a lot of newspapers back then. The picture that's come down to us of the hard-hitting, gung-ho newspaper crime reporter is usually a brash, fast-talking fedora-sporting man.
Hurry up! This is important. Give me the desk. Jake, wait, pull your back. Williams, Jake, pull your back. I don't know yet. Look out! Williams just went over the wall.
Well, that was from the 1931 movie The Front Page, based on the play by Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur. They remade the picture almost a decade later as His Girl Friday, starring Rosalind Russell in the role of reporter Hildy Johnson, who was the male role in the original played by Pat O'Brien. But that was basically a casting decision by Howard Hawks to boost box office and add a romantic angle and some sparkling dialogue between Russell and Cary Grant. It's not a reflection of any kind of gender equality in the newsroom back then. I think the title change itself underscores the fact that it was still a man's world. Now, there were newspaper women in the past, in the 19th century, pioneers such as Nellie Bly, whose real name was Elizabeth Cochran, Ida B. Wells, who was one of the original founders of the NAACP, and Winifred Black, who wrote for the Hearst Papers under the name Annie Laurie, just to name a couple. But by the early 20th century, while there were still more women journalists working on newspapers, but in general, they were thought of as either social crusaders or somewhat dismissively as sob sisters, women who generally worked on the society pages, the agony columns, or the softer human interest stories for papers covering the quote unquote women's angle. But today I want to focus on two Los Angeles newspaper women who broke that mold, Florabelle Muir and Aggie Underwood. They didn't do that as a conscious act of social justice or any kind of push for equality. They just happened to be damn good at what they did. Now, why did I choose these two women to focus on? Well, they both had spectacular, high-profile careers covering all the major murders, trials, and scandals of the day. Plus, and this was the deciding factor for me, they both wrote extensive and best-selling autobiographies. Florabelle Muir wrote Headline Happy in 1950, and the year before that, 1949, Agnes Underwood put out her famous Newspaperwomen, from which I stole the title of this lecture, Newspaperwomen. Actually, in Hollywood, we don't call it stealing, we call it an homage. I just wanted to stop here, actually, and show you my own copy of Newspaperwoman that I got a few years back. Kind of excited about that. It's signed and inscribed by Aggie to Fletcher Bowron, who was the mayor at the time. And she also, I believe, put her own, this is her photo that I think she put into the flyleaves. It looks like there was a second one there, but the one I had, the copy I had only had this one in it. I just thought this was really cool. Anyway, back to the show. Florabelle Muir, based in LA for most of her career, was also a columnist for the New York Daily News. She wrote for Daily Variety, for local papers like the Herald and the Mirror, and even had a radio show on KFI. She also developed an affinity for some of the more colorful underworld characters like Bugsy Siegel and Mickey Cohen. As a matter of fact, she used to joke that hanging out with guys like Mickey Cohen was good for her as a reporter because she might, in her words, be around when someone tries to take him out. Well, it worked because that's exactly what happened. In 1947, Florabelle and her husband were both with Cohen's party as they were leaving Sherry's Cafe on the Sunset Strip. From the lot across the street, they were pelted with shotgun bullets. A ricocheting deer slug hit Florabelle in what she delicately described as her derriere. This time, Florabelle Muir not only got the story, but she was part of it. And we'll get back to that in a little bit. Agnes Underwood came up through the ranks of the LA newspapers covering sensational crimes like the killing of Thelma Todd and the Black Dahlia murder. Aggie ended up making news herself when she became the first woman city editor for a major US daily. While they both had a tenacious love and drive for newspapering, these two women couldn't have come from more different backgrounds. Florabelle Muir was born in 1889 in the then still Wild West town of Rock Springs, Wyoming. She came from a large family, the youngest of 11 children. She felt that that might have helped her develop a great strength of will and determination, as she put it. Florabelle was also supposed to follow her sisters into one of the few accepted careers for women at the time, teaching. And even that was simply intended as a placeholder until achieving the ultimate goal, marriage. She attended the University of Washington in Seattle. And to make a little extra money, she started working at the college paper. She got hooked. A few years later, she found herself in Salt Lake City, Utah, looking for a real newspaper job. But being a woman and a college-educated one at that gave her two strikes as far as the editors were concerned. But ironically, it was just those qualities that led to her first break. At the time, there were two major papers in Salt Lake City, the Tribune and the Herald. Florabelle had been knocking on doors with little success when finally, surprisingly, she was asked by the editor of the Salt Lake Herald to cover a city council meeting. He didn't really give a damn if she could do the job or not, but he was feuding at the time with a veteran Tribune reporter who was covering the same meeting, and he hoped sending a college girl cub reporter, as he put it, to cover the same event would be a poke in the eye to the fellow. What the editor got back, though, was a very well-written newspaper story, the first of many from Florabelle Muir. Aggie Underwood was born as Agnes Wilson in 1902 in San Francisco. Aggie's mother died when she was just 5 and her younger sister barely 2. Her father's work required him to travel and didn't allow for the care of 2 young girls, so in effect, they became orphans. As Aggie writes in her autobiography, they were moved around like checkers to live with relatives in Indiana, to foster homes, and as a teenager, Aggie came to Los Angeles to live with yet another relative, but this one had ulterior motives. The woman lived in Hollywood and had dreams of making bank by turning Aggie into some kind of child star. As Aggie writes in Newspaperwomen, she put big bows in my hair, dressed me younger than my 16 years, and traipsed me around to the motion picture studios. My relative finally realized I was hopeless as film fodder. After a few months, the woman kicked Aggie and her belongings to the curb. She still had the ridiculous bows in her hair, but now she was homeless. Aggie moved into the Salvation Army Home for Women, located downtown at 5th and Grand, which later became the Biltmore Hotel, pictured there. She also managed to find a job at the Pig and Whistle on Hollywood Boulevard, which is also still there today. It was at the Pig and Whistle that Aggie Wilson met a nice young man who worked the soda fountain by the name of Harry Underwood. They would marry a few years later in 1920. Around the time the two Pig and Whistle lovebirds were tying the knot, Florabelle Muir was becoming an established reporter in Salt Lake City. Only now she was working for the rival Tribune. She covered a story of John Borich, who had murdered his wife in a small mining town outside the city and earned himself the death penalty. Florabell was assigned to cover his execution by firing squad at the state penitentiary, which is what you're looking at right there. But the warden objected, citing a rule that only male witnesses were entitled to observe. In Headline Happy, Florabell writes, "I knew by this time that I had embarked in a game that was played mostly by men, and any handicaps my skirts put on me had to be overcome with determination if I was to be considered an all-around reporter." This is a map of the prison yard that they printed in the paper back then. These old-time newspapers really liked putting hand-drawn maps and figures onto their pages. Maybe it saved them money on film or something, I don't know. Anyway, it finally took a decree from the Utah State Attorney General to rule that in this case, Florabell wasn't a woman, but a reporter, and therefore eligible to witness the execution under the law. Still, her editor wasn't sure Florabell could go through with it, so he assigned a male reporter to accompany her as a backup. When they were walking the condemned man from the cell block to the courtyard, where the firing squad was waiting, Florabell writes that there was only the sound of their echoing footsteps until, behind me, I heard sort of a moan and the sound and smell of someone upchucking his whiskey-spiked breakfast. It turned out to be the male reporter assigned to be her backup, and Florabelle Muir ended up the only Tribune reporter to watch and report on the execution. Years later, Aggie Underwood would have a similar experience when she joined the Herald Express. In 1935, she was assigned to cover the autopsy of Thelma Todd. Todd, known as the Ice Cream Blonde, was a movie star who was found asphyxiated to death in her garage above her famous Roadhouse Cafe on the Pacific Coast Highway. It's still there if you go up the Coast Highway as you hit the Palisades. It's now home to the Paulist Productions, a segment of the Jesuit ministry. But the mysterious death caused a lot of controversy and was splashed across all the front pages. At the autopsy, Aggie was the only woman amidst the gaggle of male cops and reporters surrounding the coroner as he began his work. She watched stoically and writes that when the brain was finally removed, "I looked up. Except for the coroner's aides, I was alone beside the slab. One by one, cops and reporters had drifted away in what became a stampede to Hall of Justice restrooms. My stomach held." But Aggie never intended on becoming a reporter. A decade earlier, this is around that time, in the mid-1920s, she and Harry Underwood had moved to Ocean Park and were trying to start a family. She was happy being a homemaker, but money was tight, and Harry's salary just covered the bills. Once, when Aggie had grown tired of repairing her old worn-out stocking, she asked Harry to buy her a new pair. He refused. So over his objections, she decided to get a job and buy her own damn stockings. A friend helped her get a spot as a temporary switchboard operator on the Los Angeles Record. The lower picture there is where the old record offices were across from the Pacific Electric building. Aggie even said she could hear the trolley cars going in and out all day long. And that picture in the upper right is her at the switchboard. That's from a recreation done a few years later for an article, but it gives you the idea. One temporary job led to another. this one helping Gertrude Price, who wrote and edited the woman's page, as her general assistant. That at least got Aggie into the newsroom, and it gave her a taste of the organized chaos that she'd learned to love and thrive on for years. Late in 1927, a flash from United Press told of the capture of William Edward Hickman, a fugitive nicknamed the Fox because he had eluded capture for months. He was wanted for the brutal slaying of a young schoolgirl. As the bulletins poured in, Aggie couldn't contain her interest, and she got underfoot, looking over the shoulders of reporters as they wrote. Finally, the exasperated city editor barked at her, "All right, if you're so interested, take this dictation." Aggie typed a dictation, part of the main running story, and in her words, "I was sunk. I wanted to be a reporter." The Hickman story was a boon for all the LA papers, boosting sales at street corners and newsstands. On one of these street corners in Boyle Heights, a scrappy young newsboy who liked to use his fists was thrilled at the money he made from selling out every last copy of the Record. His name? Mickey Cohen. Florabelle Muir had also worked for a short time in LA. In the 20s, she left Salt Lake and had stints on both the Los Angeles Herald, the Los Angeles Examiner. In San Francisco, she worked on the Chronicle and the Bulletin. She worked on the Oakland Post-Inquirer, and in Chicago on the Herald Examiner. Her nomadic journey ended in 1927 when she hit what she considered the big time, the New York Daily News. Even in later years, when she became permanently based in LA, she would continue to report for the Daily News in one way or another for the rest of her career. While in New York, Floribelle Muir made her bones, so to speak, covering the killing of Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was a gambler, or sportsman, as he liked to be called, and was considered something of a crown prince in the world of bootlegging and crime. Rothstein had been shot at the Park Central Hotel after a dispute over a high-stakes marathon poker game. Florabelle was in the lobby phoning her story into the Daily News rewrite man when a hulking tough guy grabbed the phone from her hand and told her to scram because she was talking about too much about Rothstein's business. That didn't stop her from filing her story, but her editor loved the tale, and it helped fuel his impression of her as a reporter that would do anything for a story. And she didn't discourage that image. As a matter of fact, to quote her, "I became convinced my boss was relishing the thought that it would make a perfect headline if one of my dangerous playmates would put a hole in my head. Girl reporter killed by Underwood thug." Maybe that was the memory that flickered through her mind 20 years later when she was shot in the fanny with Mickey Cohen. Aggie Underwood, in the meantime, had to make her own luck when it came to getting her first big break. In 1931, Charlie Crawford, known as the Gray Wolf, had been the guy for years who ran what was informally known back then as the Combination, meaning he was pretty much in charge of gambling, prostitution, and everything vice in Los Angeles. Sort of think of him as the godfather of a very waspy Cosa Nostra. He was shot and killed at his office, along with an associate named Herbert Spencer. What made it such a sensational story was that the guy who shot them was Dave Clark, a good-looking, clean-cut former star prosecutor in the Los Angeles DA's office who was at that time on the ballot running for a municipal judgeship. So while every reporter in LA was focused on the shooting itself, Aggie wondered what Dave Clark's parents were thinking and feeling. She started tracking down every single Clark in the LA phone book, and there were quite a few even back then. If Aggie had developed one trait growing up, it was determination. She managed to find them living in Highland Park, and when she made the interview, it made the front page for the LA Record, giving Agnes Underwood her first front page byline. As a side note, after Crawford's death, the property where his office was located, that's a bad picture of his office there, is at 6665 Sunset Boulevard. That property went to his widow, Ella Crawford. A few years later, perhaps as a way to either erase old memories or rehabilitate the Crawford name, she turned that property into a business complex with an international theme. She called it Crossroads of the World. I'm not really sure, but I think that part on the lower left of the picture looks a lot like the original office where Crawford was shot. Here's the way it looks today. It's still there. Headline after headline followed for Aggie, and she learned her craft as a reporter. But the Los Angeles Record was a failing newspaper by this time. By 1935, the cannibalization that had been going on among the LA dailies was in full swing, and the Record was gobbled up by the Post, which itself would be shortly gobbled up by the then equally gobbled together Herald Express. But getting back to Aggie, there's another shot of the old Herald building. When the Record folded, she jumped at the chance to work for the Herald. In Aggie's words, she felt she was finally ready to work for Hearst. Around the same time, on the other side of the country, Florabelle Muir was ready to get out of the newspaper business, at least for a while. She was married now to Dennis Morrison, a fellow New York journalist who worked at the World Telegram. He convinced her he could support them while she took some time off to try novel writing. She hated it. The solitary life of a novelist was anathema to somebody used to the breakneck pace of news business. It was like putting a thoroughbred racehorse into harness dragging a field plow. But salvation came in the form of an offer from Fox Studios to come out to Hollywood and write film scenarios. In the 1930s, when talkies came in, the studios scrambled to find good writers and were poaching from the literary ranks, not just big names like William Faulkner or Raymond Chandler, but anyone who could put words on the page in an efficient manner. I found this one shared credit written by Floribelle Muir for a 1935 potboiler called Fighting Youth. But she wasn't in Hollywood very long before the newspaper game came calling again in the form of her old boss at the Daily News with a desperate mission: get hold of Mary Astor's diary. Mary Astor was a famous film star whose most memorable role was probably in The Maltese Falcon. Astor was going through a nasty divorce and a custody battle at the time over her affair with playwright George S. Kaufman. She'd kept a diary with salacious details not only of that affair, but many others with Hollywood A-listers of the day. Reporters were falling all over themselves to somehow get their hands on those pages, with some papers willing to dish out $5,000 or more to do it. Florabelle Muir got the pages and the scoop, and while she would never reveal her methods or her source, she was quite proud of the fact that she did it for less than $500. You might wonder that now if Florabelle Muir was settled in LA, that she and Aggie Underwood wouldn't cross paths. Well, they did. They weren't friends socially. They were professionally respectful, though, even though they worked for competing publications and traveled in somewhat different circles. They both covered the 1944 Charlie Chaplin paternity trials over a child he was purported to have fathered with a young starlet named Joan Barry. While Aggie covered the trial for the Herald, she gives credit for breaking the story to someone else. Aggie writes in her book, "The story was broken originally by Florabelle Muir, New York Daily News correspondent in Los Angeles and Hollywood. She's a hard-hitting, hard-working, square-dealing reporter whose presence on an assignment indicates top news is breaking." They also coincided on some of the more sensationally violent front pages, such as the murder of Bugsy Siegel in 1947. Florabelle had known Benny Siegel, nobody ever called him Bugsy to his face, since her New York days in the 20s. Back then, she recalled him as a young tough who hadn't reached voting age. When she met him again years later in Hollywood, she noted that he wore $200 sport coats and styled himself as a more urbane sportsman and investor. One of those investments was in the gambling ship, the Rex, run by Tony Cornero. This is what I talked about at the Santa Monica History Museum Gala a few years back. She was actually even on one of the boats when they raided the ship and wrote about it in a nationally published story for the Saturday Evening Post. Florabelle and Benny Siegel remained on cordial terms in LA. He even called her at the Daily Variety office just hours before he died to thank her for a review she had given to his newly opened Flamingo Hotel the previous week. He said he was going to dinner at Jack's at the Beach, which was on the old Ocean Park Pier, and asked if it was as good as people said. This was the same Jack's mentioned a few weeks ago in the fine Throwback Thursday we had on the Ocean Park Pier. By the way, that screenshot at the bottom, that's a screen grab I got from an old episode of the Rockford Files, which explains the 1970s land yacht parked in front. He obviously took her recommendation because later that evening, when he returned to the Beverly Hills house rented by his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, he was on the sofa reading the paper when 9 shots through a front window ended his story. Florabelle was on her way to a party in Beverly Hills that night when she heard about it, and she instead went directly to the house on Linden Drive, which is still there. And she writes of the scene, he was still slumped on the couch with part of his handsome face torn away. The Los Angeles Times was lying across his knees, and on it was stamped, "Good night, sleep peacefully, compliments of Jax." The gangland slaying was big news, of course, and all the papers were on it, including the Herald. Aggie Underwood had just become city editor, but she still had a reporter's nose for what would make good copy. So drawing on her experience since the Thelmatod autopsy, she knew how bodies were indexed in the morgue. She assigned a photographer to snap the iconic picture of the ID tag tied to Bugsy's big toe. It was an exclusive for the Herald and was syndicated to papers throughout the country. 1947 was a banner year for sensational murders in LA. In January, when the gruesome scene of Elizabeth Short's bisected and mutilated body was found, Aggie was among the first reporters to arrive at the open lot on Norton Avenue. She was all over the story, and when she interviewed some of Elizabeth's friends and found they had nicknamed her the Black Dahlia after a movie, The Blue Dahlia, that had come out the previous year, Aggie knew she had her headline, and the name stuck. There were a number of suspects, and Aggie was knee-deep in investigating the case, which is still unsolved to this day, when she was pulled off the story. The reason? To become city editor of the Herald Express. While it wasn't unusual by the late 40s to find women in the reporting ranks on the major city dailies, a woman at the editor's desk was unprecedented and became national news in itself, with Aggie profiled in both Time and Newsweek. So why did Jack Campbell, the Herald managing editor at the time, promote Aggie? He was a notoriously tough boss who ran through city editors by the handful. No one held a job longer than 6 months under him. Aggie was a veteran, battle-tested reporter by then, and she had the respect and admiration of everyone she worked with, but perhaps he saw in her someone who was as unabashed as he was. Aggie writes of an incident from a few years before where she was asked to work on Christmas Day. "My husband and I were separated, and I had planned to spend the weekend with my children. The city editor, Lou Young, insisted that I cover a story because there was no one else to do it. After I had rearranged my plans and scheduled the children to spend time with their father, Lou informed me that another reporter was available. I was mad as hell. So after a few drinks with some photographers, I went and got this barracuda that I was storing to take home to cook for dinner. Lou, you dirty son of a bitch, I said, and whacked him across the face with a fish. I jumped on top of the desk and belted him with a fish every time he tried to run around. And then Jack Campbell, the managing editor, came out of his office, and I thought for sure I'd be fired. But instead, he laughed, doubled up, and yelled, 'Hit him again, Aggie.' This photo is a recreation of the event at a party celebrating her 10th anniversary as editor. Jack Campbell never regretted his decision. Aggie would remain city editor on the Herald for the next 17 and a half years, far outlasting any of her predecessors. By the time Aggie took over the newsroom, she knew the business from the ground up. But she also knew that the Hearst reporters were often as colorful as the stories they covered. And Aggie inspired loyalty by making the job fun. She kept a baseball bat on her desk to, in her words, shoo away pesky Hollywood press agents, and a starter's pistol in her desk drawer. When things were dull in the newsroom, she'd pull it out and fire it at the ceiling while yelling, "Don't let this paper die on us today." Her staff loved her. These are some pictures from the anniversary party at the paper. Perhaps they thought she needed a bigger bat. While it was hard for Aggie to give up the thrills of being a reporter and tie herself to a desk, Florabelle Muir had no such restrictions. Her daily variety column did keep most of her focus on the movie business, but she maintained her connections with the shadier side of the law. With Bugsy Siegel gone, the role of crime boss in LA fell to that punk newsboy who hawked copies of the LA Record on street corners years before, Mickey Cohen. Unlike most in the underworld who tried hard to avoid the spotlight, Mickey reveled in it. The nattily dressed little guy ruled his empire in style. Cohen, who had dropped out of grade school, strived to escape the hoodlum image later in life. He developed a taste for fine clothes, so much so that he opened a shop, which was his front for his illegal businesses, called Michael's Exclusive Haberdashery. Floribelle Muir's husband, Dennis, He even asked Florabelle Muir's husband, Dennis, to teach him a few new words every day to improve his diction and vocabulary. Once, while they were visiting Mickey at his home, Dennis asked to borrow a copy of War and Peace he saw on the shelves. Mickey said yes, but told him to make sure he brought it back. Why, Florabelle asked, are you going to read it? Not in 1,000 years, Mickey answered, but I want it back because it leaves a hole there on the shelf when it's gone. It matches the color of them other books. On a July night in 1949, Florabelle and her husband were leaving a party in the Hollywood Hills and decided to stop for a nightcap at Sherry's on the Strip. Inside, she spotted Mickey and his party at a table, and he invited them to join. Later, as they were all near the entrance waiting for their cars, Florabelle ducked back inside to grab the early morning papers. That's when the shooting started. This is another one of those sketches the papers were in love with then. But you can see the empty lot and the billboard the gunmen were hiding behind in the lower part of the screen. Just for reference, across the street is where Sherry's was, and up to the upper right of the drawing is where Tower Records is now, right across Hammond Street. Florabelle said she looked out the door and could see gunfire coming from across the street and then felt something thud against her hip. She commented to the hat check girl, those bastards are throwing rocks in here too. Then she saw the flattened deer slug that had ricocheted off the doorframe and hit her in the backside. Her first response was to rush outside to see who else got hit. Mickey was hit in the shoulder. Others in the party were also hurt. Dee David, a young starlet, suffered shotgun wounds, and Mickey's right-hand man, Nettie Herbert, lay on the sidewalk, mortally wounded in a pool of blood. Florabelle says her husband shouted at her from the inside, "Get in here, you idiot, you'll be killed." But she adds that it wasn't his warning that took me back into the cafe. I went to telephone the Mirror's city desk, and within minutes, assistant editor Sid Hughes and a photographer arrived, and only the Mirror got pictures at the scene of the shooting. Agnes Underwood and Florabelle Muir shattered stereotypes in the male-dominated world of crime reporting, but neither saw themselves as any kind of activist fighting for gender equality. They were simply willing to do whatever it took to get the job done. As a matter of fact, in Aggie's book, Newspaperwomen, the very first sentence is, "I am no feminist." Side note, I had to do some research to make sure that was really a term back in 1949. I'm surprised it was. But I don't think it was really her femininity, to use a word, that Aggie would draw upon for her success. It was her sense of compassion and empathy that made victims and criminals alike feel comfortable enough to talk with her freely. Or as Aggie put it in an interview after retirement, I had a miserable childhood, and I had been in almost every circumstance the person I interviewed had been in. Maybe it was because I could sympathize with them that they felt they could trust me. In 1962, the two remaining Hearst papers in LA, the Morning Examiner and the Afternoon Herald Express, moved to form the Herald Examiner. It was a culmination of the merger of all the Hearst papers in LA. I hit that a little too early, but it's starting when the Herald gobbled up the Express, and then when the Herald Express itself merged with the Morning Examiner. That left LA with only two major newspapers, the Morning Times and the Afternoon Herald. 2 years later, Aggie was promoted again, this time into management. But the world had changed. Newspapering had changed. Aggie sadly put away the gun and the baseball bat that had sat on her desk for years, realizing that they and the unfettered newsroom culture she thrived on had become anachronistic. Aggie stayed on as managing editor for a few years, but she found the place to be dull. And in 1967, when a labor strike was called against the Herald, she decided her time was up and retired. The strike continued for 10 more years, and that, along with declining circulation for an afternoon paper in LA, proved too much in the end for the Herald Examiner, and the paper closed for good in 1989. Florabelle Muir continued to provide stories for the New York Daily News, but more and more her bailiwick became the celebrity coverage and the Hollywood beat. In 1966, she wrote the obituary for Hedda Hopper, and then, I'm sure it was a total coincidence, took over writing Hedda's column on Hollywood. She also became something of a celebrity herself, even rating a caricature befitting the walls of the Brown Derby. She would continue to write her column right up to the month she died, in April of 1970. at the age of 80 years old. Aggie Underwood enjoyed her retirement, spending time with her grown children in Arizona and Colorado. She became something of a celebrity herself, enjoying a continuing stream of awards, commendations, and interviews. She was even featured on an episode of the show, This Is Your Life. Most of her obituaries mention the fact that when the host, Ralph Edwards, summed up at the end, calling Aggie a great lady, Aggie snapped back at him, "I'm no lady." In 1981, in failing health, Aggie moved to Greeley, Colorado to live with her son and her grandchildren. She died in 1984 at the age of 82. And that's going to wrap that up. I close with the logo too.
Larry, that was fantastic. It is amazing to hear about that period of history in Los Angeles. I think that we forget how colorful it was, because I think a lot of times film and television often cover that period in Chicago and New York pretty extensively. Mm-hmm. We don't really see a lot of that in art in Los Angeles. And so to hear the actual stories was great. And, also great to hear about the depth and breadth of newspaper coverage during that period. Really was a lot of it. And for you to highlight Florabelle and Aggie in that way, really, I was not aware of their contributions to news in the city at that point. And I suspect I'm not alone. So thanks for doing that.
Oh yeah, no, it was terrific. LA was actually, I love LA history. And LA was really a wild town. I mean, it was a very corrupt town. There were, Frank Shaw was a mayor who got recalled in 1938 because his brother was selling police badges out of City Hall to criminals. It was a wild town. I think the reason you might not see a lot of it in film like Chicago and the East Coast is because it was kind of a gang that couldn't shoot straight kind of mafia here. There was no organized crime from the East Coast until Bugsy Siegel came out, and even then it was hard to do. They said at the time it was because LA has so many different organizations, the sheriffs, different police, different cities. It was hard to pay everybody off at the same time, so they just didn't bother to do it. But it's got a wild history. I had to leave out a lot of stuff that both of them covered, especially Aggie. There were some sensational murders. The Clara Phillips, the Tiger Lady. There was the Rattlesnake Killer. There were a lot of things. But I urge everybody to just look them up, as I have been doing for the past couple of weeks on the web, and find out what you can.
Larry, tell us a little bit about the building that you've got in your background.
Well, it's still there. That's the Herald Examiner building, which was the Herald Express building. Actually, I think it's changing. Let me see if I can put a different one up for you. Oh, you can't really see it because I'm in the way. Anyway, that's downtown. And the LA Times building was downtown for years. They finally moved to El Segundo a couple of years ago. That building is amazing inside and out. I've not been inside since they restored it and declared it a landmark, but it's supposedly gorgeous. It's kept exactly the same. Yeah, there were a lot of papers in LA, and the Hearst papers were usually the more sensational ones. They were the ones that would put the blood-spattered pictures on the front page, and a lot of those diagrams with photos with labels on them and stuff like that. The Times tried to take like a more reserved attitude. They were a more conservative paper. And I think that merger for the Herald Examiner, when Herald Express merged with the Examiner, that was in 1962. And people don't talk about that, but that was a backroom deal they made with the Times. The LA Times had two papers in LA too. They had a morning paper, the Times, and their afternoon paper was called the Los Angeles Mirror. They put that out to compete with the Herald Express, which was the afternoon paper, but Hearst had a morning paper called the Examiner. And in one of those deals, because the Hearst papers were having trouble financially, they made a deal with the Times. We'll close our morning paper if you close your afternoon paper. And that's what happened. The same day that the Herald Express was formed, the Los Angeles Times took over the LA Mirror, and that was closed.
Interesting. Well, we've got a few questions from our audience, so I want to get to those. Okay, so Stephanie Bluestein says, well researched, Larry. She's done a lot of research about Aggie, and she's curious to know more about her $110 million lawsuit against CBS and the offer about mobster Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano.
I didn't bring that up because it was just running out of time, but yes, she was a battler to the very end. And by the way, Stephanie, I saw in my research one of the papers you did, and it was very interesting. Fratiano, when he ratted on the mob, in a book that came out, I think in 1981, just when she was moving to Colorado, written by Ovid Damaris, accused her of, well, let me give a little backstory. When Israel was becoming a nation, Mickey Cohen and Ben Hecht got together and were sending arms to the Irgun in Israel for the fight for independence. And what Jimmy Fratiano said was that was a scam, that they were actually keeping the money they raised. And he said that Aggie Underwood lied about it in the paper because she was buddies with Mickey Cohen. And she was too, they'd written to each other. So she found that defaming. I mean, that's a slander against her. So she sued them. She was taking it to a court case, and it was only made moot because she died. I think her relatives gave up the case after that, but she was willing to fight up to the very end. There's a reason they called him the Weasel.
Linda Cowgill asks,
hi, Linda.
Do you remember Warren Beatty's Bugsy? And did you find it relatively accurate or not? She said, great talk, she enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Bugsy was, I liked it. It was pretty good. I don't think it was completely accurate. They really built up the Virginia Hill part. But in general, yeah, it was right. His murder was never solved either, although for some reason, don't ask me why, 3 hours after he was shot, before it got in the papers, before it was even on the radio, 3 guys walked into the Flamingo Hotel and said they were taking over. 3 of the co-investors, mob guys, walked in and said they were taking over the hotel. So obviously everybody in that world knew about it. And I think the last thing I heard was, no, I don't remember who they pinned for the murder, but it was a couple of mob guys.
Vanessa Gibson asks, do you know how she ended up on the boat on the way to the Rex? Was that a lead?
Oh yeah, well, she was on top of that story the whole time. I should do a whole nother talk about the Rex. Tony Cornero, there were 4 gambling ships out in the waters, 2 in Santa Monica and 2 in Long Beach. When Earl Warren made this big raid on the ships, he did it in secret. He there's a lot of corruption. They actually hired a prison bus to take the cops down there to board the boats, and they wouldn't even let them go off to go to the bathroom because they didn't want to tip anybody off. So they managed to surprise 3 of the boats and close them down and confiscate everything. But Tony Cornero knew they were coming because he knew that there were a couple of undercover cops that came on the board. So when they came to his boat, he shut the fire doors and put these huge fire hoses on the boats that came after them. And he was there for 9 days. It was called the Battle of Santa Monica Bay. And he held off the cops. He held off Earl Warren. He played up in the media. He said he was in international waters. He actually took it to court, to the US courts, because he was trying to declare that Santa Monica wasn't really a bay. It was a bight, meaning that the international line was 3 miles off instead of, as the guy said in the last one, instead of 12 miles off the coast. So yeah, she was on the boat as one of the reporters. They had reporters going out there. So she was there from the beginning, and she knew Tony. She knew all these guys. Matter of fact, he would even throw bottles of brandy and sandwiches to the reporters on the boats when they came out there while the battle was going on.
Mike Teverbaugh says, terrific presentation. He's curious about Florabelle's experience working for the studios. Did you discover anything about her opinion of studio overlords and the slow process of production?
No, hi, Mike. I know Mike. He's actually a former LA Times reporter himself, works in our business. I didn't find too much about that. I wanted to see more about it. I just didn't have enough time to get into it. I think she came out here and she wrote one movie. She might have had one other credit. I just know that she was really only happy writing news. She liked the chase. I think both of them really had a taste for the chase, for the thrill of tracking down a story and the danger, actually. I just saw in some of the comments, people were asking about sources, research sources. I had a lot of good sources I found. I just want to give a shout out. One was a thesis paper I got from CSUN by a woman named Shirley Saito in 1988. Really got into Aggie Underwood's background story and kind of got into her mind a little bit. I thought that was great. And then there's a website called Deranged LA Crimes I found, run by a woman named Joan Renner. That's got a lot of great stuff, a lot of great pictures. All those, seedy murders I was talking about, they're all there.
Gangland LA is yours for the taking if you want to dig in. Thank you for that. Well, Larry, I think that's it. We got you out in time for the game as promised. Thanks for doing this today. We really appreciate it. It was super interesting. Again, not really a topic we hear a lot about. So thanks for doing it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Like I said to you the other day, it's been the thing that keeps me occupied, so I don't have to look at the news too much right now. Okay. I like the news from back then a lot better.
A couple of things before we go to everybody. So please follow us on social media. That's where you can get the latest updates on everything Santa Monica History Museum. Next week, we are going to conclude our series with Allison Rose Jefferson, and she's going to talk about African-American leisure sites. Promises to be another interesting and wonderful conclusion to our summer series. We are excited to announce that we've been picked up for the fall. And so you'll be able to check us out on Thursdays at an upcoming date to be announced. Watch our website, watch our social media channels to learn more about that. And we are excited to bring you a slate of interesting programs for the fall. Thank you all so much for attending tonight. We really do appreciate it. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for being here tonight. We'll see you next week.